Okay, a word about the Gospel of Mark before we move on to other things. This is in line with the Q document or Q Gospel. Why is Mark attacked more than any other of the Gospels? See, it is common belief that Mark was the first Gospel to be written. That is accepted, and I accept that too. But the other assumption is that because Mark was the first, the other Gospels use Mark as the framework. That is something I don't agree to, because they have no need to use Mark as a framework. They have as much authority to write their own Gospels as Mark had. So if that's the common belief, then if I can criticize, or if scholars can criticize Mark, the Gospel of Mark, then the other Gospels would rise and fall with Mark's Gospel. If Mark is considered as inauthentic, as frivolous, and as a fairy tale, then the other Gospel would be considered as so. So Mark has been singled out for criticism, especially by Q, the proponents of the Q source, saying that Mark wasn't, the person who wrote Mark wasn't bright enough as to be able to record the sayings of Jesus and then match them up with the Old Testament sayings that he had helped. He had a Q source, which is totally made up. And my source is Eusebius. See, in studying the Gospels, the New Testament, all were written in the 1st century. And how do we know their authenticity if we don't have the originals? Or we have copies, a lot of copies. But we have the comments of the early church fathers, those people immediately succeeding the apostles. After the death of apostles, it's not that the church disappeared or vanished. There were people left in charge who wrote and commented on the Gospels, and after them there were other people, and it went down the centuries after the apostolic age. And we can trace from the writings and commentaries of these early church fathers what they said about the Gospels. We have a person, you might hear of a person called Papias. He was very early. He wrote and commented on the Gospels and on the New Testament writings. He's read the originals, but we don't have Papias' writings, but we have subsequent church fathers who has read Papias and have commented on Papias' writing. And this goes down over the centuries to what we have today. And then we read of Peter appearing in Rome. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read of Herod having killed James, the brother of John. And Herod saw that it pleased the people. So he went after Peter. So Peter was put into prison, presumably waiting to be beheaded or killed or whatever. And God released him from prison, and he went, remember the story in Acts where he went to the people gathered together in prayer for him, and he knocked on the door, and the girl answered and didn't open the door to him. She ran back in the room and said, "It's Peter, he's outside." And soon after that, Peter went into exile in Rome, and he preached the gospel there. And from very little is written in the Bible about what happened to Peter in Rome, but we know from early church fathers what happened. This is undisputed that Peter and Paul were the two apostles who brought the gospel to Rome and built a church in Rome. And we find Peter in Rome. This is recorded in Eusebius. Eusebius in the 4th century, who has read all the all the previous church fathers' accounts. He said those were extant means it was available to him to read, and he has read. Even though it's not extant today, we've never seen it, but we have the accounts of Eusebius. And Eusebius writes on the history of the church, said, Peter, the strongest and greatest of the apostles, was preaching in Rome. In Acts, after Herod killed James, the brother of John, went after Peter. Peter then left Jerusalem and ended up preaching in Rome. Eusebius commended Peter on his powerful preaching of the gospel of the kingdom of heaven and salvation to souls. Eusebius continues, and thus when the divine word had made its home among them, that means the people in Rome, the power of Simon the sorcerer, he met Simon the sorcerer, it was very powerful then, he rebuked Simon the sorcerer. So here, the power of Simon the sorcerer was quenched and immediately destroyed, together with Simon himself. And so greatly did the splendor of piety illumine the minds of Peter's hearers that they were not satisfied with hearing only once, and were not content with the unwritten teaching of the divine gospel. So the people in Rome who heard Peter preach after his rebuked Simon the sorcerer and destroyed Simon the sorcerer's message and Simon himself, they were so impressed. And especially the gospel message that Peter brought with him. They were so impressed. They were not contented with just hearing it once, not content with the unwritten teaching of the divine gospel, but with all sorts of entreaties, they besought Mark, a follower of Peter, that he would leave them a written monument of the doctrine which had been orally communicated to them. Nor did they cease until they had prevailed with him, with the man Mark, and had thus become the occasion of the written gospel which bears the name of Mark. And Peter, when he learned about this, he was pleased and blessed the project. And in 1 Peter 5, verse 13, it says, Peter writes, the church in Rome sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Mark was the companion of Peter. And the criticism of that Mark couldn't have written such a brilliant account of the Gospel of Mark without the help of a Q source is preposterous, because who was Mark's source? Peter, the greatest of the apostles himself. Mark was there with Peter, and Peter confirms it in his own epistle, in his own letter. 1 Peter 5 verse 13, he said, the people in Rome greets you, and so does my son Mark greets you. He knew about what Mark did. Mark wrote a gospel according to Mark with stories told by Peter. Peter was preaching the same gospel. Peter walked and talked with Jesus, was intimately involved with Jesus' ministry the whole 3 years until his death, resurrection, and ascension. And immediately after the Pentecost, after the first Easter, Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, began to preach and teach. And from then on in Jerusalem, and now in Rome. And it was here in Rome that the people in Rome prevailed upon Mark to write this gospel. They were not happy with just listening to it just one time, an oral gospel. They want it written so that they can have it with them forever. And Eusebius speaks of Mark, after writing the gospel, left Rome and went to preach in Alexandria. So we can clearly see that any criticism of the Gospel of Mark is really unfounded, again, like I said, if they can tear down Mark, and if the others copied from Mark, then everybody's gospel is suspect. But from this account, we can see that it is not so. Understand that Satan would love to tear apart these